Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepless Scientist, a quiet place in the cosmos where your thoughts can unwind, and knowledge becomes a soft lullaby for the night. Tonight's journey will take us into the life of Isaac Newton, often remembered as history's greatest scientist, yet also as a solitary figure who carried the weight of entire universes inside his notebooks. Did this reclusive, country-born scholar really rewrite the laws of nature? We'll follow him gently, step by step, from the lonely fields of Lincolnshire to the candlelit rooms where calculus and colour and gravity itself were quietly sketched into being. But before you settle in and get cosy, I'd love if you could take a moment to like this video and subscribe, only if you truly find these quiet explorations enjoyable. And when you're ready, leave a comment to let me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always such a joy to see all the places we gather from, each in our own little slice of time. Now feel free to dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for a soft background hum, and let's gently begin our journey into Newton's world together. And if your mind begins to wander, that's perfectly fine. Let it drift. We'll still be here, quietly unfolding the story. Newton entered this world on a winter's night in 1642 by the Julian calendar, or 1643 by the Gregorian that we now use. The timing is remarkable, for it was the year that Galileo Galilei, the giant of Italian science who had pointed his telescope toward Jupiter's moons, passed away. As one great observer of the heavens departed, another arrived, though no one at the time could have imagined such a passing of the torch. The baby who came into being in Woolsthorpe, a small hamlet in Lincolnshire, was not a promising heir to the cosmos. He was born tiny, weak, so premature that neighbours doubted he would live past the night. His mother later recalled that he could have fit inside a quart mug, yet, as fragile as he seemed, the infant clung stubbornly to life, as though already rehearsing the tenacity that would one day carry him through decades of lonely study. His father, also named Isaac, had died before his birth. His mother Hannah soon remarried and left the young Isaac with his grandparents. Imagine the stone farmhouse, its walls thick against the wind, a hearth smouldering in the long English winter. The boy, small and watchful, grew up in this austere household. Such beginnings shaped him deeply. Without the soft cushion of parental warmth, Newton turned inward. He became aloof, cautious, intensely self-contained. A child whose companions were more often books, tools and thoughts than other children. We might picture him gazing out across the fields, watching the sway of branches in the wind, his mind already cataloguing motions and rhythms that others simply accepted without question. The Newton family was not poor, but not wealthy either. They were what we might call middling gentry, rural landowners with enough stability to give a boy the chance of education, though not so high in rank that he was born into privilege. This middle ground would shape his path, too humble to glide easily into elite circles, yet not so destitute as to be barred from study. He was always hovering between worlds, between country and city, isolation and public life, science and mysticism. In his early school years at Grantham, a nearby market town, Newton first encountered the teacher Henry Stokes, who encouraged the boy's natural curiosity in mathematics. The young Isaac boarded in town, staying in the house of a local apothecary. This gave him access to shelves of strange substances, bottles, powders and instruments. While other children might have seen only curiosities, Newton absorbed these materials with fascination. Here we glimpse the seeds of his lifelong interest not just in the straightforward mathematics of motion, but in the more secretive art of alchemy, with its furnaces, flasks and whispered recipes for transformation. Even as a boy, he lingered at the border between science and mystery. Yet his path was never a straight climb. For a time, after his mother was widowed a second time, she tried to bring Isaac back home, urging him to manage the family farm, but the boy was hopeless at farm work. He left gates open, let livestock wander, and spent more time doodling calculations or building little windmills in the soil than tending to crops. His heart was not in ploughs or barns. It was already slipping toward the stars, toward hidden laws, toward patterns invisible to ordinary sight. Eventually his family relented, allowing him to return to school. By 1661, Newton made his way to Cambridge, entering Trinity College. He did so as a subsizar, a student of modest means who paid for his education by working, often as a servant to wealthier students. This kept him apart socially, reinforcing his sense of distance and solitude. Cambridge at that time was still teaching the old Aristotelian view of the universe, celestial spheres, natural places of motion. But Newton was not satisfied with such inherited truths. He secretly read the works of Galileo, Descartes, and Boyle. Imagine him at night, by the dim glow of a candle poring over forbidden texts, the room around him dark, the campus asleep. These pages spoke of motion as a universal principle, of matter obeying mechanical rules, of light as more than just a divine glow. It was in those shadowed hours that Newton began crafting the foundations of his own universe. Quietly, invisibly, as though constructing a cathedral no one else could yet see. And so, the frail, fatherless boy from Woolsthorpe, who once seemed too weak to survive, carried into his young manhood a mind both restless and precise. He had learned the contours of solitude, the discipline of study, and the intoxicating possibility that the world might not be as it appeared. It might be governed by laws that waited, patient and silent, for him to uncover. As Isaac Newton grew beyond the fragile, almost ghostly child who once seemed unlikely to survive, his path began to take shape in the quiet lanes of rural Lincolnshire. He was not a boy of loud games or boisterous company, but one who found comfort in stillness and in building small, intricate things with his hands. At Grantham Grammar School, in a town not far from Woolsthorpe, he first showed signs of a mind that refused to remain ordinary. His schoolmates remembered him less for athletic feats than for his curious contraptions. Miniature mills powered by mice running in wheels, tiny water clocks dripping time one droplet at a time, sundials carefully scratched into stone to follow the slow turning of the day. These were not the amusements of a playful child alone. They were rehearsals, gentle experiments echoing the work he would later perform on the grand stage of the universe. Even then, the idea that nature could be understood by models, that forces could be imitated in small devices, was already animating his mind. His teacher, Henry Stokes, recognised this difference and encouraged Newton's bent for mathematics. Stokes offered him problems and books, a thread of opportunity that Isaac clutched with the tenacity of someone who had already learned, too young, that attention and care were not always guaranteed. During these years, Newton lodged in Grantham, staying at the house of an apothecary. For most children, the shelves of powders, jars, and strange-smelling substances might have seemed off-limits, curiosities best avoided. But Newton's eyes lingered. He studied the colours of liquids, the textures of minerals, the mysterious effects of mixtures. These experiences would later resonate with his alchemical experiments, where metals hissed in crucibles and symbols of transformation filled his secret notebooks. It is not hard to imagine the young Isaac sitting quietly in the apothecary's room at dusk, watching the light catch a bottle of amber liquid, wondering whether all of nature's secrets might be trapped, like a genie, inside its glass walls. Yet his school years were not smooth. For a time his mother, recently widowed for the second time, brought him back home to Woolsthorpe, intending that he abandon books and take up the work of managing the family farm. It was perhaps a practical choice. Books did not plough fields or feed livestock. But Isaac proved to be hopeless at farm life. He left gates unlatched, so sheep wandered freely. He ignored the timing of planting and harvest. Instead of turning soil, he turned his attention to sketching diagrams in the dirt or building toy windmills that whirred with the breeze. One neighbour recalled seeing him daydreaming beneath a hedge when he should have been chasing pigs. The countryside for him was less a place of labour than of observation, a theatre of clouds, winds and shadows of leaves. recognising at last that Isaac was destined for something beyond the farm, his family, allowed him to return to his schooling. And so, in 1661, the young man, just shy of 19, set out for Cambridge to enter Trinity College. It was not the triumphant arrival of a prodigy into halls of applause. He came as a subsizar, the lowest rung of student, one who earned his keep by performing menial duties for wealthier scholars. He would have carried trays, cleaned rooms, and done errands, all while trying to keep up with lectures. This placed him outside the easy fellowship of privileged students, reinforcing once more the solitude that had shaped his childhood. Cambridge in the mid-17th century was a strange blend of medieval tradition and the faint stirrings of modern science. The official curriculum still clung to Aristotle. Students memorised texts on natural places, spheres of motion, and scholastic disputations that echoed centuries of repetition. But beyond the sanctioned syllabus, in hidden corners of the library and in the whispered exchanges among curious minds, newer voices could be heard. Galileo had aimed his telescope toward the heavens and shattered the crystalline perfection of the old cosmos. Descartes had written of vortices of matter in motion, whirling through space like invisible eddies in a river. Boyle had begun to describe experiments with air and pressure, showing that even the void could be probed with clever devices. Newton found these voices, and they spoke to him more loudly than any lecture in the formal hall. Picture him late at night in a dim college chamber, candlelight pooling on the page, his breath clouding slightly in the chill air. While other students repeated Aristotelian categories, he copied diagrams of orbits, pondered the strange pull that might bind planets, and scribbled notes in margins that only he could understand. He was learning slowly to look past appearances, to see motion not as a mystery of qualities, but as a rule, a law, a pattern waiting to be written down. The image of Newton at Cambridge is not that of a sociable young man debating in taverns or gathering friends in courtyards. Instead, it is of a quiet figure, somewhat awkward, sometimes mocked, often overlooked. He dressed plainly, ate simply, and kept mostly to himself. Yet in that solitude he was sharpening the tools of thought. Every long evening with a borrowed book, every hidden note jotted in his own hand, was a small investment in a future few could imagine. He was, in a sense, already living in two worlds, the ordinary one of Cambridge routines and the secret one of a universe waiting to be revealed. And so, by the time the plague would later sweep through the city, forcing him to retreat to Woolsthorpe once more, Newton had already built a foundation of ideas and methods. His life up to this point had been one of exclusion and silence, of doors closed by circumstance, but also of windows opened by books, by the simple wonder of a prism, by the patient turning of thought. In that mixture of hardship and discovery, the outline of a destiny was slowly, gently forming. In the summer of 1665, the Great Plague descended upon England. It crept through crowded streets, silenced universities, and shuttered the very rhythm of ordinary life. Cambridge was no exception. The students were sent home, the colleges emptied, and silence replaced the murmur of debates and recitations. For Isaac Newton, this sudden closure was not only a disruption, but a strange gift. It carried him back to Woolsthorpe Manor, the stone farmhouse of his childhood, set among orchards and fields in Lincolnshire. The world outside was fearful, filled with sickness and uncertainty. But within the isolation of Woolsthorpe, Newton entered what many later called his annus mirabilis, his miracle year. It is a tempting phrase, elegant and compact, suggesting that in one single burst of brilliance, Newton reimagined the universe. Yet reality is more patient and layered than legend. The truths he uncovered during these months were not lightning bolts in the dark, but long glimmers, pieces of work he had already been shaping quietly, and would continue to refine for decades. Still, When looking back, these years seem threaded with miracles. Imagine the farmhouse. Thick stone walls to keep out the wind, windows that opened onto fields of waving grass, and a small study where the young scholar could arrange his notebooks, prisms, and simple instruments. The world was hushed, as though holding its breath. It is in such silences that thought often deepens, like roots reaching into unseen soil. This is where the famous apple story belongs. We all know some version of it. Newton sitting in an orchard, watching an apple fall, suddenly struck by the realization that the same force that pulls the apple to the ground might also keep the moon circling the earth. But the story, as we have it, is more myth than moment. Newton himself, years later, mentioned the apple to friends as an illustration, a way to make the invisible force of gravity visible in a simple tale. The reality is that he had already been pondering the mysteries of motion and attraction long before that fruit tumbled from its branch. The apple, if anything, is a symbol, a gentle metaphor of how ideas come to rest. They fall not from nowhere, but from branches already heavy with thought, and when they strike the ground, it is only because they have been growing silently for years. What is certain is that in Woolsthorpe's quiet, Newton turned inward with new intensity. Without lectures to attend or farm duties pressing upon him, he poured his energies into questions that had haunted him at Cambridge. Why do bodies move the way they do? Could the same simple rules explain a stone falling from a wall, the tide rising at a shore, and the planets sweeping across the night sky? These were not idle musings. He began shaping the outlines of what would later become his laws of motion and the law of universal gravitation. It was not yet a finished cathedral of thought, but the stones were being stacked, one upon another, in careful silence. There was something almost dreamlike about the way Woolsthorpe insulated him. Outside, the plague raged. Inside, in notebooks filled with scrawled Latin and symbols, he was sketching the hidden architecture of the cosmos. Solitude became a workshop, loneliness a kind of fuel. Later generations would marvel at how so much emerged from so little. A small manor house, a shuttered world, and one young man's restless mind. It is important, though, to soften the picture. We often imagine Newton's miracle year as if genius flowed continuously, like a stream without pause, but anyone who has ever tried to solve even a small problem knows that ideas come haltingly. They arrive, hesitate, retreat, return in fragments. Newton too must have spent long hours staring out the window, frustrated, or simply walking among the orchards letting his thoughts drift. Genius does not roar. It seeps, like water finding its way through cracks in stone. Woolsthorpe was not a place of dazzling revelations alone, but of slow accumulation, of patient layering. The myth of the apple compresses years of questioning into a single second, but the truth is gentler, a gradual unfolding, like dawn stretching across the fields, and perhaps that is what makes these years at Woolsthorpe so remarkable. The silence gave Newton the rarest of gifts, time to follow ideas without interruption, to sketch endlessly in notebooks, to let thoughts meander and double back, to shape crude beginnings into patterns that would later astonish the world. Most people, then as now, live lives filled with interruptions, duties, obligations, noise. Newton's plague retreat, harsh as its context was, became a suspended moment where the world outside faltered and the world inside flourished. The story of Woolsthorpe is therefore less about a single apple and more about the nature of solitude. Alone, away from Cambridge, away from the noise of debate and the burden of expectation, Newton discovered the pace at which his mind worked best. Slowly, steadily, with the patience of someone carving unseen shapes into stone. The silence was not emptiness. It was space. Space to build, to imagine, to let fragments settle into order. As we think of him in that farmhouse, the fire faint in the hearth, The orchard outside heavy with fruit, it is easy to romanticize the moment. Yet in that stillness lies a truth worth holding on to, that the greatest breakthroughs often emerge not from crowded halls or noisy stages, but from quiet rooms where a single person has the courage to listen deeply to their own questions. Newton's miracle years remind us that solitude, though heavy at times, can be fertile ground for thought. In the quiet rooms of Woolsthorpe Manor, as plague silenced the country, and neighbours whispered anxiously about death and contagion, Isaac Newton was bending his mind toward a different kind of survival, the survival of ideas. Alone with his notebooks, he began shaping what would later become some of the most powerful tools in mathematics. They were not meant simply as clever tricks or puzzles, but as languages for describing the restless world, a way of putting into words and numbers what the eye alone could never hold. One of these tools was his generalization of the binomial theorem, a way of expanding expressions that seemed, at first glance, to be tangled in endless layers. For most of us, such words sound abstract, almost forbidding, but the essence is simple. Newton was teaching mathematics to breathe more freely, to stretch beyond the neat and finite. Imagine a millefeuille pastry, a cake of many delicate layers. At first you might cut through just a few, but Newton realised that the layering could go on without end, and still there was a pattern, a rhythm, a predictable unfolding. He found a way to describe the infinite layering in a formula, so that the seemingly impossible could be written down, calm and orderly, on a page. This same habit of mind, of seeing hidden patterns in endlessness, led him to another tool, one that would transform not just mathematics but every science that followed. He called it fluxions, we call it calculus. It was his way of studying change grain by grain, of following motion not as a blur but as a sequence of tiny, invisible steps. Imagine watching sand slip through an hourglass. To the naked eye, it flows smoothly, almost without interruption. But Newton imagined each grain, each single descent, and he gave mathematics a way to keep track of that flow. The descent of sand, the arc of a cannonball, the curve of a planet in its orbit, all of these, he realised, could be understood by breaking them into infinitesimal slices, each one part of a larger graceful movement. It is striking to think that, while plague carts rattled through London streets, Newton sat in a small country room sketching the very foundations of this new language of change. He did not announce it, nor polish it for the world. He worked quietly, scribbling notes that only later generations would fully grasp. His notebooks from Woolsthorpe are full of strange symbols, unfinished sentences, diagrams of curves, algorithms for tangents. To his eyes they were steps in a private exploration. To ours they are blueprints of the modern world. There is a gentle paradox here. Calculus is often thought of as forbidding, a subject of dense textbooks and anxious students. Yet at its heart it is something serene. It says, nothing is too small to notice. Every instant, every shift, every grain of sand in the hourglass matters. The movement of tides, the fall of fruit, the acceleration of the moon in its orbit, all a part of a continuous fabric, stitched together by unseen threads of change. Newton was listening to those threads, almost as though he were tuning an instrument. And like music, once the rhythm was found, the rest flowed naturally. To soften this further, imagine the sky just after sunset. At first it seems sudden, one moment light, the next moment dark. But in truth, the fading happens little by little. The glow at the horizon thins, the first star appears, the air cools gently. If you had a way to measure each small decrease in brightness, each tiny shift of shadow, you could write down the process of twilight itself. This is what Newton offered. Not a new universe, but a new way of tracing the steps it takes as it changes. It is tempting to see him in that room, candlelight flickering, quills scratching on paper, building not only formulas but a philosophy of attention. While so many were concerned with grand gestures, cathedrals, crowns, wars, Newton was watching the tiniest of motions, giving them dignity, showing that the great arcs of planets are nothing more than endless gatherings of the smallest changes. It is, in a way, a humble vision, that the universe is not made of leaps and bounds, but of countless invisible increments, each one carrying us forward. Of course, these discoveries were not made in one sitting. He must have grown tired, frustrated, uncertain. Perhaps he stood now and then, walked to the orchard, felt the air, listened to the silence. Perhaps he stared at the flow of water in a ditch, or at the wind pressing against a branch, and returned with a clearer thought. Solitude gives no applause, no reassurance, but it does give the mind room to circle an idea again and again until it begins to glow. Later, Newton would hesitate to publish much of this work, worried about criticism and conflict. The world was not yet ready, he seemed to feel, for such tools, and so the fluxions remained mostly his secret for years, like a candle hidden under a shutter. But even in secrecy the work had been done. The language of change had been written, if only for himself. It would wait patiently, like so many of Newton's discoveries, until the time came for it to step into daylight. And so, in Woolsthorpe's silence, while sickness swept the land, Newton gave humanity something extraordinary. The ability to describe motion with precision, to follow the dance of the universe without losing a step. It was not a miracle in the sense of sudden revelation, but in the sense of patient shaping, like a sculptor chiseling stone. Slowly, quietly, grain by grain, he carved out a language that would let future generations measure stars, build machines, and even, one day, place footsteps on the moon. The farmhouse at Woolsthorpe, like many English homes of the 17th century, had rooms that could be sealed against the day. Heavy shutters closed over windows, letting only the narrowest blades of light slip inside. For most, such darkness was a shield against heat or a way to protect a room from weather. For Newton, it became a laboratory of shadows. It was here, in the quiet of plague years, that he began a series of experiments with prisms that would quietly transform humanity's understanding of light itself. The story, when told simply, is almost childlike. A beam of sunlight, a darkened room, a piece of glass cut into a triangular prism. Place the prism in the path of the sun, and suddenly the light fractures, spilling into a ribbon of colour that stretches across the wall. But in Newton's eyes this was not just a trick of optics, it was a message. Light, which had seemed pure, divine, simple, was in fact a mingling, a hidden mixture of many shades waiting to be unfolded. Imagine him adjusting the shutters, narrowing the beam, bending over with careful precision. The world outside was filled with dread. Bell tolls for plague victims, gossip about death counts. But in this darkened room, Newton's focus was on something infinitely quiet. The nature of a single ray of light. The spectrum appeared. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. Today we take it for granted. The arc of a rainbow familiar from childhood drawings. But in Newton's time, to suggest that white light was not pure but composed of many colours was both bold and unsettling. The common belief, inherited from Aristotle and carried by centuries of thought, was that light was a simple essence, changed only by imperfections in glass or air. Newton's prism showed otherwise. He went further. By passing the coloured light through a second prism, he found that the spectrum did not blur or change back into white randomly, but followed rules. Red bent less than blue, blue more than yellow. Each colour seemed to carry its own signature, its own degree of bending. And when he reversed the experiment, combining the spectrum again into white, he proved that it was not the glass that created colours, but the light itself that was already mixed. White was not simple, but woven like a rope of many strands. To bring this into our everyday imagination, think of sunlight spilling through stained glass in a cathedral. The colours are already within the light, the glass only reveals them. Or picture raindrops clinging to a window, each one bending sunlight into tiny arcs of rainbow. These are the same truths Newton was uncovering, though his instruments were simpler and his context lonelier. He was listening to light in the only way he knew how, by guiding it into silence, then letting it speak across a wall. There is something poetic about Newton's choice to explore light during a time of so much darkness. The plague made the world fearful, but within the shuttered room light revealed itself as richer, more diverse, more playful than anyone had imagined. It is as if the universe was whispering, even in times of shadow there are hidden rainbows waiting to be seen. His prism experiments were not merely diversions. They planted the seeds for what would later become his book Opticks, a monumental study that would influence not only science but also art and philosophy. The realization that colours were intrinsic to light, not distortions of it, reshaped how people thought about vision, perception, and even beauty. Painters would eventually benefit from this understanding, for the behaviour of pigments and the blending of colours could now be grounded in the physics of light itself. But in Woolsthorpe, in those plague years, it was still just Newton and his shutters, his prisms, and his notebooks. He recorded meticulously, noting angles, intensities, observations. The language was mathematical, but the act was simple. Watch, test, confirm, over and over until the pattern could no longer be denied. In doing so, Newton was practicing something essential to modern science, not just speculating, but experimenting, letting nature itself speak through repeated trials. Yet for all its rigour, there was wonder in it. Think of the first time you saw a rainbow as a child. The arc in the sky seems like a message, an impossibility suddenly present. That sense of astonishment was there in Newton's chamber, though he expressed it not in poetry, but in notebooks filled with numbers and diagrams. His achievement was to bridge those worlds, to capture wonder in the net of experiment, to show that astonishment and precision can walk hand in hand. There is another side to this story, one that foreshadows Newton's lifelong caution. Though he discovered these truths about light in the 1660s, he waited decades before publishing them fully. He was hesitant, wary of criticism, protective of his fragile discoveries. The colours that shone so brightly in his shuttered room remained for many years mostly his own private rainbows. The world would not see their full beauty until he was ready. In this way, Woolsthorpe gave Newton more than solitude. It gave him a canvas. On it he painted with the colours of light, even as the world outside grew darker. His prisms, those small wedges of glass, became windows onto the invisible, revealing that even the most ordinary sunlight was layered with mysteries. And in that farmhouse during a plague that silenced nations, a young scholar uncovered rainbows not in the sky, but in the silence of a darkened room. By 1667, the plague had eased, and the university at Cambridge slowly reopened its gates. Students returned, professors resumed their routines, and the silence that had cloaked the colleges began to lift. Isaac Newton too left the seclusion of Woolsthorpe and returned to the world of books and lectures. Yet he was no longer the same young man who had departed. He carried back with him ideas that were still rough, private and fragile, like sketches in the mind not yet ready for display. 2 years later, in 1669, Newton was appointed to one of the most prestigious positions in the university, the Lucasian Professorship of Mathematics. It was remarkable for someone still so young, a recognition of his abilities that spread quietly through Cambridge's corridors. The chair had been established only a few years earlier, intended to elevate mathematics and natural philosophy into the heart of intellectual life. For Newton, it became both an honour and a burden. He was by nature not a gifted lecturer. His shyness was legendary. Those who came to hear him speak often found the experience puzzling, even disappointing. He sometimes muttered softly, his words more for the paper in front of him than for the audience at his back. At times, no students arrived at all, and he delivered the lecture anyway, quietly reading to the empty room. It was not that he lacked brilliance, his notebooks overflowed with discoveries, but that he lacked the desire to parade them openly. To Newton, knowledge was something to be guarded, refined, kept until it was beyond doubt. He moved cautiously, like a man carrying a lantern through a dark wood, unwilling to let the flame be blown out by careless winds. Yet despite his reluctance to share his thoughts in words, Newton could astonish when he chose to demonstrate with things. Around this time, he turned his attention to a problem that plagued astronomers: telescopes. The instruments of the day used lenses, and those lenses betrayed their users with distortions of colour, rings of blurred rainbow fringes around bright stars. Newton, remembering his prism experiments at Woolsthorpe, realised that the problem was not simply faulty craftsmanship but the very nature of refracting light, and so he designed something new, a telescope that used a mirror instead of a lens to gather light. This reflecting telescope was far smaller than the great refracting tubes of his contemporaries, yet it revealed objects with greater clarity. Imagine the astonishment of the Royal Society when Newton's compact device showed the moons of Jupiter, the phases of Venus, and the sharp edges of the moon without the coloured blurs that had frustrated earlier observers. It was as if he had built a secret keyhole to the heavens and was offering others a chance to look through. The telescope was, in a sense, Newton's way of speaking without speaking. He might stumble in words, but in glass and polished metal, in wood and careful assembly, he could let his ideas shine. It was a glimpse of what he could do when he let the world see, and yet, true to his nature, even this invention he revealed reluctantly, almost with embarrassment, as though the object might invite more trouble than admiration. Those who knew Newton in these years often sensed this contradiction. On one hand, he was already crafting insights that would shift the foundation of science. On the other, he kept them folded away, tucked into notebooks or guarded in private discussions with only a few trusted friends. It was not secrecy for its own sake, but caution. Newton dreaded criticism. He had grown up in a world where ridicule was painful and lasting, and he feared that premature exposure of his work might lead to attack. So he preferred silence or carefully chosen disclosures over the risk of being misunderstood. This habit of secrecy can be imagined as a kind of protective layering. Like the onion in a kitchen, Newton's genius was hidden under many skins. Each layer concealed the next, and only rarely did he allow others to peel them back. His telescope was one such moment, an unveiling that hinted at what lay beneath. But for every discovery he allowed into the light, there were a dozen he kept in shadow, refining them alone at his desk long after midnight. The Lucasian professorship gave him status, but not the satisfaction of shared dialogue. He was not a natural leader of students, nor a man eager for disciples. He seemed instead to shrink from the human noise around him, preferring the certainty of numbers, prisms, and instruments. To those who watched him, Newton was already a paradox, a man given one of the highest public platforms of scholarship, yet one who seemed almost allergic to the very act of public exchange. And so these years at Cambridge established a pattern that would define much of his life. When forced, he could reveal brilliance. When left alone, he preferred to withdraw, to work in the silent chambers of thought. His telescope had announced him to the Royal Society, and his Lucasian chair gave him prestige, but the man behind these titles remained as solitary as ever. He was like a star glimpsed through clouds, bright, undeniable, yet half hidden, its light never fully reaching the ground. By the early 1670s, Isaac Newton's reputation had reached beyond Cambridge's quiet cloisters. The reflecting telescope he had built, with its neat wooden frame and polished mirror, had captured the attention of the most distinguished body of natural philosophers in England, the Royal Society of London. For Newton, this was both an honour and a test. The society was not just a circle of scholars, it was the stage upon which ideas were announced, examined, and often challenged with ruthless energy. To be welcomed into it meant that his work was being taken seriously. To remain within it meant he would have to endure the sharp edges of debate. In 1672, Newton was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society. Almost immediately he was encouraged to contribute something of substance. Perhaps emboldened by the reception of his telescope, perhaps persuaded by those eager to see his private brilliance displayed, he submitted a paper describing his prism experiments on the nature of light and colours. For years he had carried these results in silence, convinced that white light was not a pure essence, but a mixture of many hues, each bending at a slightly different angle. To release such ideas into print was, for Newton, a rare act of courage. The reaction was swift and divided. Some were astonished. Here was a young man offering a bold and elegantly simple explanation for a puzzle that had vexed thinkers for centuries. His experiments seemed clear, his logic compelling, but others bristled. Among them was Robert Hooke, one of the most active and sharp-tongued members of the Royal Society. Hooke insisted that Newton had overlooked possibilities, that light might still be a wave, that the experiments did not prove what he claimed. Christian Huygens, working across the Channel, voiced similar doubts, arguing for a wave-like behaviour of light. Newton, unused to public dispute, recoiled. To him, criticism felt less like dialogue and more like an assault. He was not a man who thrived on debate. He was a man who thrived on silence, on the careful unfolding of ideas away from noise. The Royal Society, however, was noisy by design. Letters flew back and forth, challenges were raised, reputations sharpened their edges against one another. Newton, who had taken a great risk in publishing, found the experience wounding. In the months that followed, he answered some objections, defended his methods, tried to clarify. But the taste of conflict lingered bitterly. He began to withdraw, retreating into the familiar shell of secrecy that had always protected him. For decades afterward, he would publish little, preferring to keep his discoveries close until he was absolutely certain they could withstand the storms of criticism. It is here that the image of Newton as a tortoise retreating into its shell fits most gently. His mind carried vast treasures, but he would only extend them cautiously, pulling them back at the slightest sign of threat. This moment also revealed something deeper about Newton's personality. He was a man who demanded certainty, who disliked ambiguity, who wanted his truths to be beyond dispute. Yet science is rarely so clean. It thrives on argument, on testing, on revision. For Newton, this culture of give and take was uncomfortable. He wanted conclusions that stood like stone walls, not scaffolding that could be shifted with the winds of opinion. When others challenged him, he did not see it as the natural rhythm of inquiry, but as an erosion of his foundations. Still, for all his discomfort, Newton's ideas did not vanish. They simmered in the background, circulating quietly, influencing those who pondered them even as he himself withdrew. His fellowship in the Royal Society remained. His telescope continued to be admired, but his voice grew quieter, almost absent. He was, in effect, present in name but absent in spirit, a member of the learned body who preferred the shadows of his study to the stage of debate, and perhaps that was the only way he could continue. For a mind as intense as his, criticism did not simply brush off like dust, it settled heavily. By choosing silence, he gave himself space to keep working. While others squabbled in letters and meetings, Newton returned to his notebooks, refining, calculating, dreaming. His genius was not extinguished by dispute, only driven deeper underground, like a stream that disappears into limestone only to re-emerge elsewhere with greater force. Looking back, this storm with the Royal Society shows both Newton's strength and his fragility. He had the courage to publish something that changed how light was understood, but he lacked the ease of spirit to endure the turbulence that followed. It reminds us that even the greatest minds carry vulnerabilities, and that genius does not always walk hand in hand with resilience. Newton's retreat may look like weakness, but in another sense it was simply his way of surviving, by returning to the soil where his ideas could grow without interference. So we picture him again, not at the crowded meetings of London, but at his desk in Cambridge, quill scratching, shutters drawn, papers scattered. Outside, the world debated. Inside, Newton nurtured thoughts that, when finally revealed decades later, would astonish the very critics who had once doubted him. The storm of 1672 did not end his work. It only taught him to hide it more carefully until the time was right. By the mid-1680s, Isaac Newton had already spent years in relative silence. He lectured sparsely at Cambridge, shared little with colleagues, and hoarded discoveries in the privacy of his notebooks. The Royal Society still admired him, but he had become something of a shadow, known more for what people suspected he knew than for what he had actually published. It was in this quiet, almost forgotten state that a friend came knocking, a man whose curiosity would coax Newton back into the light. His name was Edmund Halley. Halley was everything Newton was not. Gregarious, outgoing, and comfortable in company. He loved travel, conversation, and the exchange of ideas. He had sailed to map southern stars, wandered across Europe, and returned with the kind of restless enthusiasm that thrives on questions. Where Newton was a tortoise, Halley was a bird, moving swiftly between places, alighting on puzzles and carrying them on to others. It was Halley, not Newton, who set into motion the creation of one of the greatest books in science. In August 1684, Halley visited Cambridge with a question. Astronomers had long puzzled over the paths of planets, those graceful ellipses that seemed to defy simple explanation. Johannes Kepler had shown the geometry, describing how planets moved in ellipses with the sun at one focus, but he could not fully explain why. The prevailing theories still leaned on old ideas of swirling vortices of matter, a universe imagined as a giant whirlpool dragging the planets along. Halley wanted something firmer. He asked Newton, what kind of force, acting on the planets, could explain their elliptical orbits? To Halley's astonishment, Newton answered quietly that he had already solved it years ago. The force, he explained, was inversely proportional to the square of the distance. Double the distance, the force becomes a quarter. Triple the distance, the force shrinks to a ninth. That simple proportion, the inverse square law, was the key to the planet's dance. One imagines Halley leaning forward, eyes widening, scarcely believing what he was hearing. For years, philosophers had circled the problem, arguing, debating, guessing. And here was Newton saying calmly, almost offhandedly, that the answer had long been sitting in his drawer. When Halley asked for proof, Newton promised to send him a short treatise. Months later, what Halley received was not a short note, but a manuscript titled De Motu Corporum in Gyrum, on the motion of bodies in orbits. It was the seed from which the Principia would grow. Halley recognised instantly what Newton himself seemed reluctant to admit, that this was revolutionary, the foundation of a new science. He urged Newton to expand it into a book, to publish not only the reasoning for planetary orbits, but the broader principles of motion and gravitation that underpinned them. At first, Newton hesitated. The memory of disputes with Hooke still weighed on him, and he dreaded once again exposing himself to criticism. But Halley pressed gently, encouraging, persuading, reminding Newton that the world deserved to see what only he could see. The friendship between the two men has often been described as a candle-lighting moment. Newton's flame was brilliant but hidden, sheltered from the drafts of public opinion. Halley, with his warmth and persistence, lifted the shutter. He did not ignite Newton's genius. No one could do that, but he helped it shine outward. Without Halley, it is possible that Newton's discoveries might have remained locked in notebooks, trickling out in fragments, never reaching the grand synthesis that would transform science. Practical matters soon arose. The Royal Society, impressed by Newton's draft, agreed to publish the work. But almost at once, a difficulty appeared. The Society's finances were depleted. They had spent heavily on a lavish history of fish, an expensive book with copper plate engravings that sold so poorly it nearly bankrupted them. There was little money left to fund the publication of a dense Latin treatise on mathematics and motion. Here, too, Halley stepped in. Determined not to let the opportunity slip, he offered to cover the cost himself. Out of his own pocket, he paid for the printing of Newton's masterwork. It is a detail worth pausing over. The most important scientific book of its century, perhaps of any century, might never have reached the world if not for one man's willingness to finance it, not for profit, but for belief. In this, Halley became not just Newton's encourager, but his patron, the quiet midwife of the Principia. Everyday life offers a parallel. Think of two friends sitting together, one withdrawn, unsure whether to share something precious, the other leaning forward, saying gently, "The world needs to hear this." Sometimes brilliance waits for encouragement. Sometimes the act of lighting another's candle is the greatest gift. Halley gave Newton that gift, and in return Newton gave humanity a universe written in laws. When the first pages of the Principia began to take shape, it was not simply Newton's solitary triumph. It was the outcome of a conversation, a visit, a question asked in passing that struck the right chord. The bird had visited the tortoise, and for once the tortoise had lifted its head. When Newton finally sat down to expand his manuscript into the book that would become the Philosophia Naturalis Principia Mathematica, he was not writing casually. This was not a pamphlet or a note dashed off for colleagues. It was a cathedral in words, equations carved into stone, every line meant to endure. Between 1685 and 1687, he laboured, revising and expanding his treatise into 3 great books, each one a pillar of a new way of seeing the cosmos. Book I opened with the laws of motion. These have since become so familiar that children encounter them in school, yet in Newton's time they were radical in their clarity. The first law declared that a body in motion will continue in motion unless acted upon by a force. The second showed that the change in motion is proportional to the force applied, linking force and acceleration. The third, perhaps the most famous, told that every action has an equal and opposite reaction. But to imagine these simply as dry axioms would be to miss their gentle power. Newton was giving language to what everyone had already observed but never fully articulated. Imagine pushing a cart along a cobbled lane. If you stop pushing, the cart slows, not because motion naturally ceases, but because the stones and the air are pushing back. Imagine tossing a ball. The harder the throw, the faster it flies, the further it arcs. And imagine leaning against a wall. Your shoulder presses forward, but the wall presses back silently with equal insistence. These everyday examples are what Newton distilled into universal law. He was saying, what happens in the kitchen garden, in the market, on the village green, is also what happens in the heavens. The motions of planets are not separate from the motions of apples and carts. The same rules whisper through them all. Book 2 was devoted to dismantling the competing vision of the universe, the Cartesian vortices. Many thinkers, following René Descartes, had imagined space filled with invisible whirlpools of subtle matter, dragging planets around the sun like leaves caught in a stream. It was a beautiful picture, but Newton showed it could not hold. He demonstrated that the mathematics of vortices could not explain planetary paths with precision. The universe, he argued, was not a vast whirlpool, but something stranger. A stage upon which bodies moved under the influence of forces that acted invisibly at a distance. This was unsettling. To many, action without direct contact seemed almost magical. like pulling without a rope or lifting without a hand. But Newton's calculations were persuasive, leaving no need for whirlpools. Book 3 extended the vision outward, applying these laws to the heavens and the earth alike. He explained the tides as the pull of the moon and the sun upon the waters, their rhythms now linked not to myth but to mathematics. He described the equinoxes, the wobble of the Earth's axis, as a natural consequence of gravitational tugs, and he set the planets into their orbits not as wandering stars but as dancers bound in a great choreography, the solar system as a cosmic clock whose gears were invisible but dependable. It is hard to exaggerate the shift this represented. For millennia, people had looked up and seen mystery, chaos, and the influence of gods. Newton offered instead a universe of order, one where the same quiet rules applied everywhere. The fall of a stone, the arc of a cannonball, the orbit of Jupiter, all could be traced with the same equations. The cosmos was no longer unknowable. It was knowable if you had the patience and the right tools. Writing all this was not easy. Newton worked relentlessly, often late into the night, revising proofs, smoothing arguments, polishing Latin prose. He exchanged letters with Halley, who not only encouraged him, but also managed the practicalities of publication. Together, they kept the project alive, pushing it forward against delays, doubts, and Newton's own perfectionism. The book grew heavier, not only in content but in weight, until it stood as one of the densest works ever published. And yet, for all its density, there was beauty. Newton's diagrams traced arcs and ellipses with simple elegance. His reasoning flowed with a kind of austere grace, as though each proposition was a step in a slow dance, leading the reader deeper into the heart of motion. For those able to follow, the Principia was not just a book, it was a new way of inhabiting the universe, a key to seeing connections everywhere. One way to imagine this is to think of music. Before Newton, the cosmos was like a tune played by many instruments without clear harmony, beautiful but confusing. After Newton, it was as though he had written the sheet music, showing that beneath the apparent chaos there was rhythm, structure, and resonance. The universe was no longer improvising wildly, it was playing a score. Of course, Newton himself remained cautious, even withdrawn. He let the book speak for him, unwilling to step too boldly into the debates that would follow. But in those pages, bound and printed, he had written a universe that could be tested, applied, and used. Farmers might still read almanacs and sailors might still trust tradition, but now, behind them, there was a deeper scaffolding. The cosmos had been given a script, and it was written in the language of mathematics. The Principia was not easy reading. Few could grasp it in full, yet even those who could only touch its surface felt its weight. It stood like a cathedral of stone equations, its spire, reaching high, its doors heavy but open. To enter was daunting, but once inside one could see that the very walls were built of laws that stretched from the earth to the stars, and once such a cathedral exists, it cannot be ignored. When the Principia was finally published in 1687, it did not arrive with a fanfare of trumpets. The book was dense, written in Latin, its pages filled with geometric diagrams and long chains of reasoning. It was not the sort of text one might browse by candlelight after supper. Yet for those who could enter its halls, the effect was staggering. Suddenly, the heavens and the earth seemed to stand on common ground. Motion, once mysterious, was given rules as precise as clockwork. The universe was no longer a place of accidents and guesses, but a place where the fall of a stone and the orbit of a moon could be written in the same sentence. At first, many readers responded with awe. Scholars across Europe recognised that Newton had done something extraordinary. The great swirl of celestial mechanics, which had eluded explanation since the days of Aristotle and Ptolemy, was now laid bare with clarity. For the first time, the planets were not simply wandering lights, but obedient bodies moving under invisible laws. One could trace their paths with confidence, predict their futures, even correct the errors of older tables. Astronomy and mechanics, once neighbouring fields, were joined together as one. But not everyone welcomed this new edifice with joy. To some, Newton's claims seemed too bold, too sweeping. The idea of action at a distance, a force pulling without touching, stretching across the void of space, was deeply unsettling. For centuries, philosophers had insisted that causes must push and pull directly, like hands moving objects or fluids dragging them along. To imagine that the sun's gravity reached invisibly across 90 million miles to tug the Earth in its orbit sounded suspiciously like magic. Critics whispered that Newton had smuggled in occult qualities, dressing mystery in the robes of mathematics. Robert Hooke, never one to surrender easily, claimed that Newton had borrowed heavily from his earlier suggestions. Leibniz, brilliant and independent in his own right, began to chafe as well, eventually leading to the bitter priority dispute over calculus. The reception of the Principia was thus not merely a story of applause, but also of rivalry, suspicion, and resistance. In the salons of Paris and the universities of Germany, debates flared. Was Newton right to banish vortices and assert invisible forces? Could this new mechanics truly account for the rich, complex movements of the heavens? Despite the doubts, the power of the book began to spread. Younger generations of scholars, less tied to the old systems, embraced it eagerly. They carried Newton's methods into navigation, ballistics, and engineering. Ships could be guided with greater confidence, bridges designed with surer, knowledge of stress and load, calendars aligned more precisely with the skies. The impact seeped outward, like ink dropped into water, slowly colouring every corner of natural philosophy. Even outside the scholarly world, the shift could be felt. A sense grew that the universe itself was rational, that beneath appearances lay a deep and quiet order. The stars no longer twinkled in whimsical mystery. They circled, obeying laws that human minds could understand. For ordinary people, this was not always easy to grasp, but the mood changed. The cosmos was no longer an untamed wilderness of gods and spirits, but a garden with rules, a place one could navigate with reason. And through it all, Newton remained himself, cautious, reclusive, almost detached from the storm his book had unleashed. He did not travel to promote it, nor did he bask in public acclaim. He stayed largely in Cambridge, returning to his calculations, his experiments, and his private studies in alchemy and theology. It was as though he had raised a magnificent cathedral in the middle of the scientific world, but instead of standing proudly at its entrance, he slipped out a side door and disappeared into the shadows. The Principia thus lived a double life. On the one hand, it was a mathematical fortress, intimidating and forbidding to all but the most prepared. On the other, it was a beacon, showing what the human mind could achieve when patience, precision, and imagination were bound together. The world reacted with a mixture of awe and hesitation, like worshippers stepping into a vast and echoing sanctuary. Some whispered prayers of thanks, others doubted the architecture, but none could ignore its presence. Over time, the resistance softened. The accuracy of Newton's predictions, the elegance of his explanations, and the usefulness of his methods gradually overcame suspicion. The cosmos was not rewritten in a day, but it was rewritten. And though Newton himself remained distant, his work began to shape every conversation about nature, every calculation of motion, every attempt to understand the grand theatre in which we live. To read the story of the Principia is to see how a single book can tilt the axis of thought. It is to witness how a quiet man, working in solitude, could give the world a framework so strong that centuries later it still holds much of our understanding. It is also to recognise that such gifts are rarely received smoothly. Even the most luminous ideas arrive in storms of doubt. But in time, the storm clears, and the cathedral remains. Standing silent and tall, its spires pointing upward as if to remind us that laws, once found, outlast the quarrels that greeted them. In the story of Isaac Newton, it is impossible to avoid the long, sharp shadow cast by another figure of his age, Robert Hooke. If Newton was the reclusive tortoise, protecting his thoughts inside a hard shell of secrecy, Hooke was the restless fox, always darting between projects, experimenting, speculating and publishing at a furious pace. He was a man of extraordinary energy, often called the England's Leonardo for the sheer variety of his inventions and investigations. He built microscopes, drew the delicate structure of fleas and plant cells, designed architectural supports for London after the Great Fire, and dabbled in astronomy, mechanics, chemistry, and more. He was also quick to speak, quick to claim priority, and quick to take offence. In Hooke, Newton found not only a rival, but a mirror of the qualities he most feared in himself: the hunger for recognition, the fragility of pride, the sharpness of envy. Their feud began in earnest in 1672, when Newton's paper on light and colours reached the Royal Society. Hooke objected almost immediately. He argued that Newton's interpretation of light as composed of particles was too rigid, that a wave-like theory might explain things better. Hooke was not entirely wrong. Centuries later, physics would indeed find wave properties in light. But Newton, unused to criticism, bristled at Hooke's tone. The exchange grew sour. Newton, who had reluctantly stepped onto the stage of public debate, retreated again, his suspicion of Hooke deepening into something that was less intellectual disagreement and more personal resentment. The quarrel did not stop with light. Years later, when Newton's work on gravity began to circulate, Hooke claimed that he had already suggested the idea of an attractive force between bodies, even one that weakened with distance. Hooke pressed for recognition, hinting that Newton had taken the germ of the idea from him. Newton, fiercely protective of his originality, denied this with vehemence. The truth was more complicated. Hooke had indeed proposed an attraction, but had not worked out the precise law or the mathematical demonstrations that Newton provided. Yet in the heated atmosphere of pride and priority, subtle distinctions mattered little. To Newton, Hooke was an interloper. To Hooke, Newton was an ingrate who refused to give credit. This rivalry became legendary, colouring both men's reputations. Stories circulated, some true, some embroidered. One of the most enduring was that Newton, upon becoming president of the Royal Society after Hooke's death, destroyed Hooke's portrait so that no likeness of him would remain. The tale is dramatic, but historians doubt its literal truth. There is simply no evidence that a portrait ever existed to be destroyed. Yet the fact that the story took root speaks volumes about how people imagine their feud. Newton, towering and cold, erasing his adversary from memory. It is here that metaphor serves better than bare fact. Imagine two stars circling one another in the sky, each trying to outshine the other. They are bound by a kind of gravitational tension, caught in a rivalry that pulls them closer even as they resist. Each star glows in its own way, and the brightness of one seems only to highlight the brilliance of the other. Hooke and Newton were such stars, locked in orbits of envy and brilliance, neither able to escape the other's influence. For listeners today, it is tempting to take sides, to defend Newton's genius, or to pity Hooke's restless energy, often overshadowed by his more famous rival. Yet perhaps it is gentler to see them together as part of the same fabric. Newton's achievement would not have been as sharp without the constant irritation of Hooke's objections, like a pearl forming around a grain of sand. Hooke's own contributions, though sometimes half-finished or erratic, reminded others that curiosity is not only about neat conclusions, but also about restless exploration. The feud, though acrimonious, was also a form of dialogue, one that shaped the scientific landscape of their time. And behind the bitterness lay fragility. Both men hungered for recognition in a world where ideas were not just personal expressions but currency, in the competition for status. Both carried wounds of pride. Newton recoiled from criticism, seeing it as a denial of his worth. Hooke leapt at recognition, fearing he would be overlooked. Their feud was not only about light or gravity, it was about the vulnerability of genius, the delicate balance between brilliance and insecurity. In the quiet of reflection, one sees that this is not so different from the rhythms of ordinary life. How often do people clash not over the true substance of things, but over the feeling of being seen, respected, acknowledged? How often does pride ignite when all that was needed was a word of recognition? Newton and Hooke, for all their towering intellects, were still human in this way. Their quarrels remind us that genius does not lift a person above ordinary frailties, it often magnifies them. Hooke's shadow stretched long across Newton's life, but it also faded. By the time the Principia had secured its place, Hooke was aging, frail and embittered. Newton, meanwhile, grew in stature, eventually taking the helm of the Royal Society. Whether or not a portrait was ever erased, the memory of Hooke did dim beside Newton's monumental reputation. Yet even now, centuries later, Hooke's name lingers as a kind of ghost in Newton's story, a reminder that no star shines entirely alone, and even the brightest are shaped by the light, or the opposition, of others. So when we think of Newton sitting alone, his pen scratching, his shutters closed, we should imagine Hooke somewhere nearby, restless, scribbling in his own notebook, testing his own instruments. Two men of genius, circling, colliding, never quite at peace, yet together forming part of the same constellation. If Newton's conflict with Hooke was a battle of personalities, his dispute with Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz was something even larger. It was not only a quarrel between two men, but a clash between nations, a storm that spilled out from the study rooms of scholars into the pride of countries. At the centre of it lay a tool so powerful it would shape every science that followed: calculus. Calculus, in its essence, is nothing more than a way of tracing change. Imagine watching the shadow of a sundial creep forward, or the water in an hourglass sink grain by grain. You can see change happening, but how do you describe it, moment by moment, not just at the start and the end? Calculus is the language that lets you follow those grains of sand, those creeping shadows, with precision. It lets you measure not only where something is, but how it is moving, and how that movement itself is shifting. Without it, modern physics and engineering would have no scaffolding. With it, the motions of planets, the growth of populations, the bending of beams, even the spread of heat or disease, can be followed with remarkable clarity. Newton had begun laying down the foundations of this language during his plague years in Woolsthorpe, when solitude and silence gave him room to explore. He called his version fluxions, imagining quantities as flowing, always changing, and his method tracked how those flows accumulated or diminished. In his notebooks he had written proofs, devised methods, and even solved problems with this new approach. But true to his nature, he shared almost none of it publicly. The discoveries lay hidden, waiting. Meanwhile, across the channel, Leibniz was working in his own way. He was no recluse. He thrived in conversation, correspondence, the play of symbols and ideas across languages. Where Newton's mathematics was austere, written in geometrical demonstrations that required pages of reasoning, Leibniz sought a symbolic shorthand, a notation that was elegant and general. It was Leibniz who introduced the integral sign, the elongated integral that looks like a flowing stream, and the D that marks infinitesimal differences. His symbols were so intuitive, so graceful, that they remain the ones we use today. By the late 1670s, Leibniz had published papers outlining this new method, and others began to adopt it. Newton, seeing his own work mirrored, bristled. He insisted he had been first, that he had already devised calculus years earlier, but simply had not rushed to print. Leibniz, for his part, maintained that his own discoveries had been independent, born from his own reflections. The quarrel soon thickened with suspicion. Had Leibniz seen some of Newton's unpublished manuscripts? Had ideas travelled through letters, hints, or conversations, planting seeds across borders? The truth, historians now agree, is more generous than either man believed in the heat of rivalry. Both Newton and Leibniz, working separately, had arrived at calculus because the world itself was ready for it. The problems of astronomy, motion and geometry had ripened to a point where such a tool was almost inevitable. Just as ripe fruit can fall from more than one branch at the same time, so too can ideas, blossom in more than one mind when the soil of knowledge is rich enough. Yet the quarrel was not settled so calmly in their lifetimes. Newton's allies in England rallied to his defence, portraying Leibniz as a plagiarist. Leibniz's supporters in continental Europe fired back, painting Newton as jealous and secretive. Committees were formed, accusations written, reputations battered. What could have been a shared triumph, a recognition that two brilliant minds had converged on the same treasure, became instead a bitter division, a reminder that even in the loftiest halls of thought, human pride can sow discord. For Newton, the dispute became an obsession. He marshalled evidence, pored over old letters, and pressed his case with the relentlessness of someone who could not bear the thought of his originality being questioned. For Leibniz, the accusations were wounding, a stain upon his honour. Neither man was able to step back and see that the true story was not theft but simultaneity, not rivalry but resonance. And so, history often frames them as enemies, when in truth they were co-creators of the same language. Without Newton's deep insights, the calculus might not have gained the rigour it needed. Without Leibniz's elegant notation, it might not have spread so quickly, nor become so usable. Together, though divided, they gave us a tool that touches everything from the orbit of satellites to the tuning of radios to the very algorithms that power computers. It is tempting to look at their quarrel and sigh, to wish they could have seen beyond themselves. But perhaps there is also something tender in recognising that even great minds are human minds. They long for acknowledgement, fear being overshadowed, ache at the thought of their work being forgotten. And yet, beyond the quarrel, the work remains. The fruit does not spoil simply because the orchard has argued. Calculus, once born, lived on, its usefulness too obvious to be undone by disputes. In the soft lens of hindsight, we can picture their discoveries not as weapons pointed at one another, but as two lamps lit in different rooms, shining through separate windows, illuminating the same night. From one angle, you see Newton's flame, sharp and solitary. From another, Leibniz's, broad and symbolic. Step back far enough, and you see they are part of the same glow, spreading across the landscape of thought. For all his triumphs, Newton was not a man of endless strength. Genius, after all, is not a shield against the strains of the mind. In the year 1693, Newton entered one of the darkest stretches of his life. By then, he was already recognised as a towering figure in natural philosophy, yet within himself he was crumbling. Letters from that year, written to friends and colleagues, speak in tones of paranoia, anxiety, and deep exhaustion. They reveal a man whose mind, once so steady and precise, had begun to fray under the pressure of isolation, sleepless nights, and relentless thought. The signs had been building for some time. Newton was never known for an easy temperament. Even in his younger years, he was quick to retreat, to guard his ideas, to bristle at criticism. But in the early 1690s, something shifted. He'd been working ceaselessly on mathematics, on celestial mechanics, on alchemical experiments hidden away in his rooms. He corresponded with a small circle of friends but trusted almost no one. He went long stretches without proper sleep, his mind racing, his nerves stretched taut. When the breakdown came, it was as if a candle that had burned too long guttered suddenly, dripping wax in messy rivulets over a cluttered desk. Accounts suggest that Newton suffered from what we might today call a nervous collapse. He wrote erratic letters, accusing old allies of betrayal. He hinted that conspiracies surrounded him. His words had the strained, brittle tone of a man unable to find rest, as if each thought, once clear, now split into jagged fragments. The scholar who had bent the cosmos into equations now struggled to bend his own thoughts into calm. It is important to pause here and remember the human behind the legend. It is easy to see Newton as a statue, all marble and certainty, but the truth is softer, more fragile. He lived much of his life alone, unmarried, withdrawn from ordinary companionship. His inner world was rich with ideas, but also heavy with burdens he seldom shared. The pressure of being the solitary keeper of great discoveries, of always fearing criticism, of guarding secrets in alchemy and theology, may have weighed more than anyone around him realised. During this year of nervous collapse, Newton withdrew further. Some friends tried to reach him, offering words of comfort or counsel, but he remained tense, suspicious, restless. It is not hard to imagine him pacing his rooms at night, candlelight flickering against shelves stacked with manuscripts, the air heavy with the scent of melted wax and chemicals from experiments. Outside, the world went on with its markets and chatter, but within those walls, Newton was caught in storms of the mind that no equation could quiet. And yet he did not vanish into that darkness forever. Like many who suffer such collapses, Newton found, in time, a way back to steadier ground. He rested more, allowed himself distance from the most consuming work, and slowly his clarity returned. But the experience marked him. It was as though the candle had been relit, but the wick was shorter, the flame a little more fragile. He had glimpsed the limits of his own endurance. There is something quietly comforting in knowing that even Newton, who could describe the dance of the heavens with precision, faltered under the weight of sleeplessness and worry. It reminds us that brilliance is not invincibility. A mind can be dazzling and delicate at the same time. We imagine Newton seated at his desk, surrounded by manuscripts of unshakable logic, yet within himself he was as vulnerable as anyone, needing rest, needing care, needing a gentleness he rarely allowed. The year 1693 thus becomes a mirror, showing not the image of a triumphant sage, but of a human being who had reached his limit. Perhaps this, too, is part of the story of genius, the recognition that minds are not infinite machines but living things, with rhythms of strength and fragility. In Newton's nervous year, we see the candle's flame bending low, nearly snuffed, yet still enduring enough to shine again. And when we step back, the picture is tender. The man who had given us the laws of motion, the mathematics of orbits, the cathedral of the Principia, was also a man who sometimes broke under his own weight. His greatness was not in avoiding that collapse, but in continuing afterward, carrying on with new work, new service, and new contributions. The story of science is not only the story of discoveries, but also the story of those who bore them, with all their weariness and fragility. So as you imagine Newton in that nervous year, think not of equations or triumphs, but of a candle burning at midnight, wax dripping onto papers scattered on a desk, the air heavy and still. The flame flickers low, but it does not go out. In time, it steadies again, fragile but real, a reminder that even the brightest lights can dim, and yet still shine once more. When Isaac Newton left behind the cloisters of Cambridge and entered the bustling world of London in 1696, it marked a strange turning point in his life. He had spent decades as the archetype of the withdrawn scholar, shunning public attention, preferring candles and shutters to conversation. Yet now, appointed warden of the Royal Mint, Newton found himself responsible for one of the kingdom's most pressing problems, the nation's money. England's currency had fallen into chaos. Silver coins had been clipped, shaved and forged until the economy teetered on collapse. The air of London was thick not only with smoke from chimneys, but with the clinking of false coins, their deceit undermining trust in every transaction. And into this world stepped a man whose genius had once explained the tides of the moon. The great recoinage was not glamorous work. Imagine carts of worn and battered silver arriving at the mint, men labouring at furnaces, molten metal poured into moulds, presses stamping fresh coins day after day. It was a task of logistics and administration, not of abstract equations. Yet Newton approached it with the same intensity he had once brought to the motions of the heavens. He studied the flows of silver, the output of presses, the behaviour of officials turning numbers into order. The same mind that had calculated the orbits of planets now calculated how many ounces of silver should pass from crucible to coin, ensuring that every shilling bore the right weight and purity. But Newton's role at the mint was not confined to quiet oversight. Counterfeiting was a crime that corroded trust, and Newton, to the surprise of many, pursued counterfeiters with an almost obsessive vigour. He went beyond the duties of a dignitary. He collected evidence, interviewed informants, and followed trails into the narrow alleys and smoky taverns of London. Some stories even suggest he disguised himself, slipping into the city as a detective might, ears open for whispers of illegal coiners. The scholar who had once drawn prisms and diagrams now drew up indictments, his neat handwriting filling legal ledgers instead of mathematical proofs. One of his most famous targets was William Challoner, a skilled counterfeiter who had grown rich by exploiting the weaknesses of the coinage system. Challoner was cunning, bold, and well-connected. For a time he managed to escape justice, even attempting to portray himself as a reformer who wished to help the mint. But Newton was relentless. He built his case piece by piece, interviewing dozens of witnesses, gathering testimony, and laying out a meticulous web of evidence. Eventually Challoner was tried and hanged at Tyburn in 1699, his career ended by the quiet determination of a man who, in another world, might have ignored such matters entirely. It is a curious image, Newton as detective. We picture him not in the serene isolation of Woolsthorpe, nor in the hallowed halls of Cambridge, but in the noise of London, sifting through accounts, questioning forgers, calculating the best way to restore a nation's trust in its coinage. His genius had always been about finding hidden order, whether in the rainbow of light or the orbits of planets. Now that same genius found order in the clinking chaos of silver. The problems of money were not so different from the problems of nature. Patterns lay beneath the disorder, and with patience they could be revealed. The success of the Great Recoinage was not immediate. It required years of grinding work, of old coins recalled, new coins minted, forgeries punished. But by the early 1700s the economy had stabilised. Trust in the currency was restored. England, which had been threatened with financial collapse, found steadier ground. And much of that was due to Newton's stern diligence. He was not a man given to charm or to leniency, but his rigour was exactly what the task demanded. In his careful hands the silver of the realm regained its weight and honesty. There is a gentle lesson here. Genius is not always displayed in grand discoveries. Sometimes it shows itself in unglamorous labour, in stubborn attention to detail, in the willingness to wade into disorder until order is found. Newton's years at the Mint remind us that the same mind that can imagine universal laws can also balance ledgers, that the grandeur of science does not exclude the discipline of administration. For Newton, this was perhaps another kind of experiment, not with prisms and falling apples, but with society itself, testing whether clarity and rigour could restore what corruption had eroded. And so the image of Newton expands. He's no longer only the reclusive scholar hunched over papers by candlelight. He's also the stern official, walking the corridors of the Tower of London where the Mint was housed, his steps echoing on stone floors, his eyes sharp for deceit. In him we see the paradox of a man who could chase counterfeiters through taverns, while still keeping secret notebooks on alchemy and prophecy. the man who weighed silver coins also weighed the stars. For those who like to think of science as pure, untouched by the dust of everyday life, this chapter of Newton's story can feel jarring, yet it is also grounding. Even the greatest minds live in the world of markets and money, of law and crime, of trust and its betrayal. Newton's tenure at the Mint shows that genius can serve not only the cosmos, but also the coin purse, not only truth, but also trust. By the dawn of the 18th century, Newton's life had taken on a form that would have been unrecognisable to his younger self. The shy, solitary scholar who once lectured to empty rooms at Cambridge had become a figure of authority, a man whose very presence could set the tone of English science. The transition was marked most clearly in 1703, when Newton was elected President of the Royal Society. It was an office of influence, not only over meetings and publications, but over the currents of knowledge itself. After years of retreat, Newton now sat at the head of the table, no longer hiding his light behind shutters, but holding it like a lantern that others were compelled to gather around. The timing was significant. Robert Hooke, Newton's most persistent rival, had died earlier that year. With Hooke gone, there was no longer a shadow constantly questioning, objecting, or competing. Newton, freed from that long duel, could step into a role of unchallenged prominence. The Royal Society, which once felt to him like a stage filled with critics, was now his court, where he presided with the authority of one who had rewritten the cosmos in the Principia. Yet power has a way of reshaping even those who once distrusted it. Newton, as president, was not merely a passive guide. He was decisive, sometimes ruthless, in directing the course of the society. He influenced what was published, who was acknowledged, and how debates were settled. The man who once feared criticism now had the ability to silence others, and he was not always reluctant to use it. His personality, long marked by secrecy and suspicion, did not dissolve when wrapped in authority. It simply found new expression. One of the most telling episodes of this period was his conflict with John Flamsteed, the Astronomer Royal. Flamsteed had spent decades compiling a careful catalogue of stars, a work of patience and precision. Newton, eager to use Flamsteed's data for his own studies of lunar motion and planetary orbits, grew frustrated with the astronomer's delays. In 1712, Newton and his allies arranged to seize Flamsteed's manuscripts and publish them prematurely without the author's consent. It was a harsh move, one that revealed Newton's willingness to bend others' labours to his own purposes when he felt the greater cause, his cause, demanded it. Flamsteed fought back, eventually reclaiming much of his work, but the bitterness of the episode lingered. In this light, Newton's presidency at the Royal Society was a mixture of illumination and shadow. On the one hand, he brought prestige and authority, ensuring that the society remained the heart of English science. On the other, his rule could feel stern, even domineering. He had carried the habits of a solitary thinker. His caution, his suspicion, his fierce protectiveness, into the public arena, where they sometimes hardened into control. And yet, despite these conflicts, Newton's stature only grew. In 1705 he was knighted by Queen Anne, the first scientist to be so honoured not for courtly service, but for intellectual achievement. The ceremony placed him among the nobility, a public recognition that his work was not merely academic, but foundational to the very strength of the realm. For a man who had once avoided the public eye, the knighthood was both an elevation and a transformation. The country-born scholar, once frail and forgotten by his mother, now stood as Sir Isaac Newton, master of coins, master of the society, master of laws, both natural and civic. It is a curious arc to reflect upon. Newton began life in the silence of Woolsthorpe, an infant so small and premature that few thought he would live. He grew into the recluse of Cambridge, wary of the world. Then, in middle age, he became the stern administrator of the Mint, and finally the patriarch of English science. honoured with titles and authority. In him we see a man moving from the shadows into the centre of public life. His shy flame turned into a commanding lantern that illuminated others but could also scorch. Yet the man within remained, in many ways, unchanged. Newton never became sociable, never married, never truly softened into ease. His presidency at the Royal Society was not marked by warmth, but by control. He commanded respect, but he didn't often invite affection. He was, as always, more comfortable with principles than with people, more at home in the company of laws and calculations than in fellowship. The authority he held was real, but it sat upon a foundation of the same solitary temperament that had defined him since youth. Perhaps that is the deeper lesson of this chapter in his life. Power did not transform Newton into someone new. It simply revealed new dimensions of who he had always been. The child who withdrew from others, the student who guarded his ideas, the professor who lectured to empty rooms. All these remained within the knight and president. His story reminds us that positions and honours can shift the stage, but the actor is still the same. So let us picture Newton not only in candlelit chambers, but in the grand hall of the Royal Society, seated at the head of the table. The murmur's quiet as he raises his voice, steady and measured. Papers are submitted, disputes are weighed, decisions are made. And behind that measured authority lies the same restless, guarded soul who once found in solitude the keys to the universe. The lantern shines brightly, but the hand that holds it trembles with the same cautiousness, the same fire that it always had. When Newton finally published Opticks in 1704, the world was already accustomed to thinking of him as the author of the Principia, the man who'd revealed the invisible hand of gravity and written the cosmos in the language of mathematics. Yet Opticks was a different kind of book. If the Principia was a cathedral of abstract thought, Opticks was a cabinet of wonders, filled not with equations carved in marble, but with experiments anyone could attempt at home, using nothing more than prisms, mirrors, and a patch of sunlight on a wall. The book had been delayed for decades. Newton had performed his prism experiments as early as the mid-1660s, in those plague years at Woolsthorpe, and had begun presenting his findings to the Royal Society in the 1670s. But the disputes that followed, particularly with Robert Hooke, had made him withdraw, cautious and wounded. For years he kept the bulk of his optical research hidden in notebooks. He guarded it the way one might guard fragile glass, fearful that criticism might shatter it before it could be appreciated. Only after Hooke's death, when Newton had risen to a position of unchallenged authority, did he feel safe enough to let it out into the light. And so, in 1704, he offered Opticks to the world. Unlike the dense Latin of the Principia, this book was written in English, making it accessible to a wider audience. Instead of long chains of geometric proof, it was filled with descriptions of experiments that readers could almost see and feel for themselves. Light streaming through a small hole in a shuttered room, a prism splitting that light into a ribbon of colours, the rainbow of the spectrum stretched across a wall, its bands of red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo and violet lying side by side like threads in a woven cloth. Newton showed that white light was not pure but mixed, a blend of many colours already present, waiting to be separated by a prism. He demonstrated this by recombining the coloured bands into white again, proving that colours were not stains added to light by glass or by air, but ingredients hidden within it all along. To make the idea gentle, imagine sunlight passing through a droplet of water clinging to a window pane. On the surface, the droplet looks clear but tilted at the right angle, and a tiny rainbow appears. The purity of white is an illusion. Within it lies a hidden symphony of colours, waiting for the right stage to perform. In Opticks, Newton explored not only prisms but also reflection, refraction, and the play of colours in thin films. He described how soap bubbles shimmer with shifting hues, how oil on water ripples with iridescent patterns, how rainbows arch across the sky. These were not distant abstractions, but sights anyone might notice in daily life. He took the everyday marvels of light, the glint of a spoon in water, the colours on a glass surface, and turned them into windows on the structure of nature. And yet, the book was not without its bold theories. Newton leaned toward the idea that light was made of tiny particles, corpuscles, that behaved in certain ways as they passed through media. Though later centuries would show that light also has wave-like properties, Newton's careful experiments still laid the groundwork for centuries of optical science. He did not present light as a simple phenomenon, but as something layered and mysterious, requiring patient unravelling. The reception of optics was enthusiastic. Scientists and philosophers marvelled at the clarity of the experiments, the elegance of the observations. If the Principia had been awe-inspiring but forbidding, Opticks felt approachable, a book that invited the curious to follow along. One could almost imagine Newton standing in a dim room, holding a prism up to a shaft of sunlight, and then quietly saying, "Look, you can try this yourself." There is something almost tender in that shift. For so long Newton had hidden his ideas, fearful of criticism, retreating at the first sign of dispute. But in Opticks he allowed himself to open the shutters, literally and figuratively, to let others share in what he had seen. The experiments did not require the rarefied air of mathematical genius. They required only curiosity, patience, and a bit of light. The legacy of Opticks lies not only in its findings, but in its method. Newton placed experiment at the centre, showing that knowledge grows not only from abstract reasoning but from direct engagement with the world. In that way, Opticks was a model of the scientific method: careful observation, repeatable experiment, cautious inference. Its influence rippled outward, encouraging generations of natural philosophers to look more closely at ordinary phenomena, to see nature not as opaque but as full of hidden messages written in light. And when we think of Newton in those years, we might imagine him once again in a shuttered room, much like the one at Woolsthorpe, a single beam of sunlight entering through a narrow slit. He places a prism in its path, and the room blooms into colour. To us it seems magical, but to him it was a revelation of structure, a glimpse of the hidden order in something as common as daylight. The rainbow on the wall was not only beauty, it was proof. Proof that light itself, the most familiar of things, could still surprise us when viewed at the right angle. In that image lies the heart of Opticks, the gentle suggestion that wonder need not be distant. It can be found in a soap bubble, a raindrop, a shard of glass on a windowsill. Newton, the stern master of gravity, here became a patient guide of rainbows, inviting the world to notice that even the simplest beam of light is filled with mysteries worth chasing. When most people hear the name Isaac Newton, they imagine the mathematician of the Principia or the experimenter of optics. Yet there was another Newton, one he kept carefully hidden, working in silence long after midnight, his hands blackened by soot, his notebooks filled with cryptic symbols and coded recipes. This was Newton the alchemist, a seeker not only of laws but of transformations, who believed that metals might conceal secrets as deep as the heavens. In the 17th century, alchemy had not yet faded into the realm of superstition. It was a vast, tangled tradition, blending early chemistry with mystical hopes. Some alchemists searched for the philosopher's stone, a mythical substance said to turn base metals into gold. Others sought elixirs of health, or visions of divine truth hidden in matter. To modern eyes it may seem strange, even misguided, but to Newton it was part of the same great search for order in nature. If gravity-bound planets and light revealed hidden colours, why might not matter itself carry within it the power to change, to transmute, to speak in a language of fire and ash? Newton pursued alchemy with the same intensity he gave to mathematics. His surviving notebooks contain thousands of pages of experiments, translations of obscure texts, and recipes for strange concoctions. He wrote of green lions or philosophic mercury and coded formulas that only another adept might begin to decipher. In his laboratory he mixed powders, heated metals in crucibles, and recorded the hiss of reactions with the care of a watchmaker noting the ticking of a clock. Imagine him alone at night, flames flickering, the smell of sulphur and smoke filling the air, his eyes reflecting the glow of coals as he leaned close to see what secrets might emerge from the furnace. For Newton these were not idle diversions. He believed that hidden in the writings of the ancients, whether Greek philosophers, medieval scholars, or Renaissance magicians, there lay fragments of lost wisdom. His notebooks show a man searching not only for practical recipes, but for connections between matter, spirit, and the cosmos itself. He copied passages, annotated them, compared their cryptic allegories to his own results. Just as he once found patterns in planetary orbits, he now sought patterns in the strange vocabulary of alchemical texts. It would be easy to dismiss this as folly. After all, Newton did not discover the philosopher's stone. The transmutation of lead into gold remained forever out of reach, and yet in his experiments he advanced techniques that would later serve chemistry. He studied how metals combined, how substances reacted, how heat and pressure changed the behaviour of matter. He may have clothed it in esoteric language, but beneath the veils he was performing some of the earlier steps toward what we now call chemical science. There is something moving about this hidden side of Newton. The man who seemed to command certainty in public, knight, mint master, president of the Royal Society, was in private a restless seeker of mysteries. His alchemical work was never published in his lifetime. He feared ridicule, feared that his reputation as the architect of modern science would be tarnished if others knew he spent hours stirring crucibles and poring over cryptic manuscripts. And so he locked these writings away, thousands of pages that would not see light until centuries later, when historians discovered them. Perhaps this secrecy was part of what kept Newton alive. His public face was stern, disciplined, austere. But in the alchemist's furnace he allowed himself to wander, to chase possibilities that had no guarantee of success. Here, he could follow imagination into firelight, explore not only what was known but what might be. The laboratory, cluttered with glass vessels, powders and strange instruments, was a place where he could dream, even if the dreams were cloaked in smoke. One can picture the scene, the Tower of London outside sleeping in the quiet of midnight, while within Newton's quarters a faint glow rises from the furnace. The room is crowded with manuscripts, their margins filled with his tight, careful script. A crucible hisses, metal bubbling under heat. Newton watches, recording each shift in colour, each spark that leaps from the fire. For him, these were not trivial curiosities. They were signs, hints, perhaps even whispers of a deeper truth, that matter itself might be alive with transformation, waiting for the right key to unlock it. What makes this part of Newton's story so fascinating is how it reveals the complexity of genius. He was not simply a rationalist who banished mystery. He was a man who lived with mystery, who chased it from the stars to the prism, from the minting of coins to the alchemical crucible. His path was not straight. It wandered, doubled back, vanished into shadows, re-emerged in brilliance. To imagine Newton only as the cool geometer of laws is to miss the human being who also sought wonder in fire and in myth. And in that sense, Newton's alchemy is not a stain on his record, but a reminder of the breadth of his imagination. Genius does not always run in straight lines. It bends, hesitates, detours. The mind that wrote the Principia also lingered over ancient manuscripts, convinced that wisdom might be buried under layers of allegory. The hands that turned pages of mathematics also stirred the contents of crucibles, listening to the hiss of transformation. So as you drift with this story, imagine Newton not only as the architect of modern science, but also as a midnight experimenter hunched over a furnace searching for secrets in smoke. The fire flickers, shadows dance on the walls, and the great scholar alone in the quiet watches carefully for a sign that matter has revealed one more of its mysteries. If Newton's alchemy seems surprising, then his writings on prophecy are even more so. Hidden among his private papers are thousands of lines not on mechanics or optics, but on scripture, temples, and the end of days. The man who gave us the universal law of gravitation also devoted countless hours to interpreting the Book of Daniel and the Revelation of St. John. It is as though the same mind that weighed the planets could not resist weighing eternity itself. Newton's religious beliefs were unusual for his time. Outwardly, he was a loyal member of the Church of England, as was expected of any Cambridge professor or royal official. But in private, he held unorthodox views. He was what later scholars would call anti-Trinitarian. He could not accept the doctrine that Father, Son and Spirit were equal persons of a single God. He believed instead in a more austere, singular divinity. These views would have been dangerous to publish in his lifetime, risking charges of heresy. And so, like his alchemical pursuits, he kept them hidden, recorded only in notebooks never meant for public eyes. Much of Newton's prophetic work centred on numbers and timelines. Just as he calculated orbits and tides, he also calculated the span of kingdoms and the approach of the world's end. He examined ancient calendars, studied the dimensions of Solomon's temple, and tried to fit biblical passages into a chronology of history. At times he turned to the ruins of Atlantis, to legends of lost civilizations, as if all of history were one great equation waiting to be solved. Among his more famous predictions was the suggestion that the end of the present world order might not come before the year 2060. Newton did not describe this as a fiery destruction, but rather as a transformation, a new beginning under divine order. He wrote cautiously, saying he did not mean to determine the time of the end, only that it could not happen earlier than his calculation suggested. Yet his words have been remembered, repeated, and sometimes sensationalized, as if the scientist had stepped from the laboratory into the role of a prophet. It can be unsettling to reconcile these sides of Newton. The same man who showed that the moon's pull governs the tides also speculated about doomsday. The same precision that weighed planets was applied to passages of Revelation. To modern readers, it can feel like a contradiction, but to Newton, it was all part of the same quest. He believed the universe was a book written by God, and that nature and scripture were two chapters of that same work. The laws of motion revealed one kind of truth, the prophecies of Daniel revealed another. Both were expressions of a divine order, waiting to be decoded. Imagine Newton late at night, surrounded not by prisms and crucibles this time, but by stacks of Bibles, ancient histories and commentaries. His pen moves swiftly, copying verses, aligning numbers, sketching diagrams of temples and timelines. The candle burns low, dripping wax on the table. Outside, the world carries on, London streets alive with noise, but within this room Newton is bent over scripture, searching for patterns as carefully as he once searched the skies. To him, the two quests were not so different. Both required patience, discipline, and the conviction that hidden order lies beneath the surface of things. These religious writings, like his alchemical ones, remained largely unknown until long after his death. When they were rediscovered in the 20th century, many were startled. Some wondered whether Newton's genius had been wasted on mysticism, whether his image as the founder of modern science was somehow diminished. But others saw it differently. His prophetic studies remind us that Newton was not a machine of reason, but a human being, shaped by the hopes, fears and traditions of his time. He lived in a world where the boundaries between science, religion and magic were porous, and he moved freely across them, searching always for unity. There is a quiet poignancy in this side of his life. Even the greatest scientist of his age felt the need to lean on prophecy when the universe seemed too vast, too mysterious, too indifferent. He could chart the orbits of planets, but he could not chart the purpose of it all, and so he turned to scripture, not to replace science, but to complement it, to find meaning where mathematics could not speak. His prophecies were not predictions of spectacle so much as meditations on order, on the belief that history itself had a rhythm, like the motions of the heavens. And perhaps that is the deeper truth. Newton's prophecies remind us that knowledge and wonder are not always separate. The mind that measures can also yearn. The heart that explains can also hope. Newton lived at the threshold of modern science, but he carried within him the long traditions of mysticism and faith. He was, in the end, not only a man of laws, but a man of longing. So let us picture him one final time in this chapter, the old scholar with a candle at his desk, the flame casting long shadows as he traces the numbers of Daniel's weeks, the measurements of the temple, the dates of kingdoms rising and falling. He is searching, as he always did, for the order beneath appearances. Whether in the orbit of Jupiter or in the prophecy of Revelation, he believed the same truth might be found, that the universe, vast and mysterious, is not chaos, but a design, written in symbols of light and in symbols of time. As the years carried Newton from middle age into old age, the image of the man changed in the eyes of the world. No longer the withdrawn scholar who hesitated to publish, or the restless investigator hunched over crucibles, he became a figure of reverence, a symbol of what it meant to be a natural philosopher in an age learning to name itself as scientific. By the early 1700s, Newton was no longer the frail, solitary child of Lincolnshire, or even the fiery disputant who clashed with Hooke and Leibniz. He was Sir Isaac Newton, knighted by Queen Anne, Master of the Mint, President of the Royal Society, a man who embodied the authority of knowledge itself. His later years were marked by comfort, something his younger self could hardly have imagined. He lived in a well-appointed London townhouse with his niece Catherine Barton, who kept his household and provided him with companionship. From his days as a lonely boy left with grandparents while his mother remarried, Newton had often been set apart, emotionally distant. But in this final phase of his life, he enjoyed the warmth of family and a circle of admirers. He had wealth, earned from his tenure at the Mint, enough to free him from any concern about daily survival. He had honours, the knighthood, and the Presidency of the Royal Society, which placed him at the pinnacle of English science. And he had reputation, a name spoken with respect across Europe. Even so, restfulness did not mean idleness. Newton continued to attend meetings of the Royal Society well into his 70s, often carried there by carriage, as his body began to stiffen with age. He still presided over debates, weighed in on experiments, and sometimes even relived the old disputes with flashes of stubborn pride. The fire that once made him retreat at criticism now burned more steadily, less like a blaze and more like the coals of a long-lived hearth. He was respected, sometimes feared, but always regarded as the living embodiment of the age's pursuit of knowledge. One recurring visitor of thought in Newton's later years was Halley's comet. He and Edmund Halley had once worked closely, Halley encouraging him to publish the Principia. Halley himself had predicted that a bright comet observed in 1682 would return in 1758, more than 30 years after Newton's death. Newton never lived to see the prediction fulfilled, but in his later life he still reflected on comets, their mysterious orbits, their possible roles in shaping the Earth's atmosphere, or even in biblical floods. The sight of a comet streaking across the sky must have stirred both awe and recognition, like glimpsing a friend from long ago passing once again along a familiar road. As his health declined, Newton suffered from bladder stones and the slow weakening that comes with age. But he remained mentally sharp, still capable of weighing arguments and carrying on conversations about matters of state, of coinage, and of science. Visitors often described him as grave but approachable, his sternness softened by the dignity of years. To walk into his presence was, for younger natural philosophers, something like stepping into a chamber with a monument, living stone, a man, whose very existence seemed to embody the achievements of the century. Newton's days followed a quieter rhythm now, where once he had stayed up until dawn scribbling equations or mixing chemicals by firelight, now he spent hours reading, walking slowly through his garden, or sitting in conversation with trusted friends and family. He was content, though contentment for Newton never meant complete ease. The restless edge of his mind never dulled entirely. There were still questions he had not answered, mysteries of light and motion, puzzles of prophecy and history that remained unresolved in his private manuscripts. Even as his body aged, the sense that the universe was larger than any single life remained with him, a background hum that never went away. For England, Newton was more than a scholar. He was a national treasure. In an age of wars and shifting politics, he represented stability, reason, and mastery of nature. Visitors from abroad sought him out, hoping to see the man who had explained the orbits of the planets. Younger thinkers, from mathematicians to natural philosophers, treated him with reverence, even when they disagreed with his views. To meet Newton was to meet the gravity of science itself, clothed in human form. Yet beneath the honours and reverence, there was still the same man who had always lived in tension between solitude and recognition. Newton accepted the praise, but he never became a flamboyant public figure. His voice remained measured, his manner austere. He did not delight in show, but in order, and in that way he carried into old age the same traits that had marked his youth. What had changed was the world around him. Where once he had feared ridicule, now he was beyond reproach. Where once he had hidden discoveries, now he was celebrated for them. Time had turned the reclusive scholar into the sage of London, the living elder of science. It is comforting in a way to imagine Newton in these years, sitting by the fire in a quiet room, his books within reach, visitors at the door, his niece moving about the house. Outside, the streets of London were noisy with carts and horses, merchants and chatter. But within those walls, Newton lived in the glow of a lifetime's work, his achievements already shaping the education of generations to come. His body may have weakened, but the structure he had built in thought, the laws of motion, the description of gravity, the experiments with light, stood firm, carrying the weight of the scientific world as securely as archers hold up a cathedral roof. And so the old sage endured, his mind still restless, his reputation secure, his days quieter than the furious pace of his youth. He had measured the heavens, sought gold in crucibles, traced prophecies in scripture, reformed the currency of a nation. Now, in the dusk of life, he carried not the urgency of unfinished work, but the dignity of a completed ark. A candle burning lower, but glowing steadily, its light warming those who gathered near. By the spring of 1727, Isaac Newton was 84 years old. For a man born so frail and premature in the cold of Lincolnshire in 1642, it was a remarkable age. He had lived through plagues, political revolutions, wars, and the turbulent transformations of an England that had crowned kings, executed one, restored another, and welcomed a new dynasty from across the sea. Through all of this, Newton had remained, a steady flame of intellect burning while the winds of history shifted around him. But no flame, no matter how steady, can burn forever. In those final months, his health declined more sharply. The bladder stones that had troubled him grew unbearable. Nights became restless, not with the furious writing of youth, but with pain that even the greatest mind could not master. His body weakened, but his mind retained clarity, and he remained composed, carrying the same gravity he had embodied in life. He still received visitors, though more often now he would recline in a chair rather than stand. Those who entered his room in those last weeks often felt they were stepping into a sanctuary. Quiet, austere, filled with books and manuscripts, the air heavy not with incense but with the weight of thought that had accumulated over a lifetime. On March 19th, 1727, Newton slipped into unconsciousness. The man who had measured the heavens, who had weighed light, who had traced prophecy, passed away peacefully in his sleep. There was no thunderclap, no celestial sign, only the quiet extinguishing of a candle that had burned long. He died in London, in the home he shared with his niece, Catherine Barton, who had cared for him until the end. For a life so filled with storms of discovery and controversy, the end came as a gentle stillness, the silence after a long symphony. News of his death spread quickly, and England mourned. Newton was not merely a scientist, he was a national figure, one of the few men who could be named in the same breath as the greatest poets, generals, and statesmen of the realm. The grief was not just personal for those who knew him, but cultural for a nation that had come to see him as the embodiment of English learning. To lose him was to lose a steadying star, one whose light had guided an entire age. His funeral was grand, worthy of a statesman. On March 28th, his body was carried in procession to Westminster Abbey, the resting place of monarchs, poets, and heroes. The abbey, with its soaring arches and echoing aisles, welcomed him as one of its own. Imagine the scene. Pallbearers carrying his coffin through the dim light of stained glass, the hush of footsteps on ancient stone, the murmured prayers rising upward into the vaulted ceilings, the air filled with incense and candle smoke, and the abbey seemed to breathe slowly, as if even the stones paused to take in the gravity of the moment. He was buried not in obscurity, but with honours reserved for the most celebrated. The inscription at his tomb praised him as the one who, almost divine, had revealed the motions of the heavens and the laws of nature. His body lay among kings, but his epitaph spoke of a mind that had reigned in realms greater than kingdoms. For those who stood there that day, there was a sense not only of mourning, but of awe. Here was a man who had bent the universe into words and numbers, who had given language to forces unseen, who had shown that the cosmos could be described with clarity. It is worth pausing here in imagination to walk slowly down those stone aisles, past the tombs of poets and rulers, until you reach the monument of Newton. The abbey is cool and quiet, the kind of place where sound lingers in echoes, where a single cough or footstep seems magnified. You stand before the stone, tracing the carved letters with your eyes, and you realise that this man, whose name is almost synonymous with science, rests in silence like any other mortal. The weight of the tomb is heavy, but heavier still is the realisation that genius itself must eventually return to dust. And yet, there is comfort in the thought that though the body lies still, the work endures. Newton's laws, his optics, his vision of a universe bound by gravity, all remain alive in the world. They continue to move planets, guide tides, and bend light. His mind may have stilled, but the echoes of his thought ripple outward endlessly. The abbey holds his remains, but the world holds his legacy. For his contemporaries, Newton's death marked the end of an era. The Enlightenment was blossoming, and many saw him as its herald. He had shown that human reason could uncover truths once thought inaccessible, that the universe could be known not only by faith but by observation and calculation. To bury Newton was to bury a symbol of that triumph, the first great monument of modern science. And yet, even in death, he remained complex. The manuscripts he left behind contained not only equations and experiments, but alchemy, prophecy, and theology. He was not the pure rationalist posterity sometimes imagines, but a man whose mind stretched across disciplines, pulling the mystical and the mathematical into a single restless search. In that way, His burial in Westminster Abbey feels fitting, not because it places him among saints, but because it acknowledges the breadth of his humanity. Scientist, scholar, seeker, sage. As you let this part of his story settle, picture the Abbey once more at night, after the mourners have gone, when only the faint glow of candles remains. The stone arches rise into shadow, and in the silence you might almost hear a whisper, not of prophecy, not of equations, but of rest. Newton, who never found rest in life, finally lies in peace. The footsteps of visitors echo in the halls, the nation sleeps, and the old sage of science is carried into eternity, his light now part of the quiet firmament of memory. Death, for a figure like Newton, was not the end of the story, but the beginning of another kind of life. Life in memory, in influence, in the unfolding pages of science. When the stone closed over his grave in Westminster Abbey, the man was gone, but the echo of his work continued to spread, travelling outward like ripples from a stone cast into a still pond. For generations that followed, Newton became more than a scholar. He became a monument, a measuring stick against which all later thinkers were compared. In the years immediately after his passing, editors and admirers worked to collect and publish writings he had left unfinished or hidden. Some were technical, lectures on optics or notes on chronology. Others were deeply private, his theological musings and alchemical experiments, manuscripts he had never dared to release while alive. To those who encountered these papers, the image of Newton grew more complex. Here was not only the clear thinker who had set down the laws of motion, but also the restless seeker who scrawled calculations of biblical prophecy, who drew diagrams of the Temple of Solomon, who recorded chemical experiments in cryptic symbols. It was as though, after the public Newton was buried, a secret Newton arose, surprising and unsettling those who thought they had known him. The scientific community, however, focused most on what could be carried forward. The Principia continued to be read, studied, and built upon. Newton's laws of motion and the universal law of gravitation became the bedrock of mechanics. Ships at sea plotted courses using them, engineers built machines with them, astronomers mapped the heavens under their guidance. For more than 2 centuries, Newton's framework seemed unshakable, a cathedral of equations under which all of nature could be understood, and yet the story of science is never still. By the early 20th century, a new voice emerged, Albert Einstein. With his theory of relativity, Einstein showed that Newton's universe was not the final word. Space and time themselves could bend. Gravity was not an invisible force stretching across empty space, but the curvature of space-time itself. To some, it seemed that Newton had been dethroned, but Einstein himself did not see it that way. He spoke of Newton with reverence, calling him a shining light, acknowledging that without the steps Newton had taken, there would have been no foundation to build upon. Relativity did not erase Newton. It extended him, as if a higher balcony had been built upon the cathedral he had already raised. In this way, Newton's legacy is best understood not as perfection, but as foundation. He did not answer every question, nor did he always see clearly. His forays into alchemy and prophecy remind us of that. But he built a ladder high enough that others could climb beyond his reach. Each rung he shaped, calculus, optics, gravitation, allowed later generations to see further, until Einstein and others could glimpse horizons Newton never imagined. His genius was not in closing the book of science, but in giving others a book to continue writing. Even today, his influence persists in quiet ways. Every time a spacecraft launches, its trajectory owes a debt to Newton's equations. Every time an engineer balances the forces on a bridge or an architect considers the stress on a beam, Newton's laws are at work. Children in classrooms drop apples or roll balls down ramps to feel for themselves the truths he once wrote down. His work is no longer cutting edge. it has become something even more enduring, part of the common language of how we see the physical world. And yet, the fuller legacy of Newton is not only in formulas but in example. He showed that solitude could be fertile, that even in years of plague and retreat, a mind could transform the world. He showed that criticism, while painful, need not erase conviction. He showed that science is not only about publishing quickly, but about waiting until one is ready, even if the wait is decades long. And he showed too that genius is human, that it comes with fragility, with mistakes, with detours into mystery. To remember Newton, honestly, is to remember not only the man who built the Principia, but also the man who scribbled in secret about alchemy and the end of time. Perhaps this is why his story continues to resonate, not only as history but as comfort. Newton's life reminds us that even the greatest mind of his age carried doubts, hesitations and eccentricities. He was not a flawless statue but a searching, restless human being. And from that humanity came discoveries that shaped centuries. There is solace in knowing that greatness can grow out of solitude, uncertainty, even obsession. So what came after Newton was not only the continuation of his equations, but the continuation of his example, the pursuit of hidden order, the belief that nature speaks in patterns, the patience to follow those patterns wherever they lead. The ladder he built is still being climbed, and though new theories have risen above his, the rungs remain solid and steady. To look up at the night sky and know that planets move in calculable paths is to live still within Newton's universe, even as we now sense layers of mystery beyond it. In Westminster Abbey, his tomb remains. Visitors pause, read the inscription, and pass on. Above them, the arches rise into shadow, much as Newton's work still rises above us, vast and enduring. But the true monument is not in stone. It is in the quiet persistence of his thought, in every calculation of motion, in every prism of light, in every orbit traced across the heavens. Long after the Abbey's stones have weathered, the principles Newton revealed will remain, woven into the fabric of the universe itself. And so his story closes not with an end, but with a continuation. Newton's life was a flame, but his legacy is a constellation, still visible, still guiding. He gave us laws, but more than that, he gave us the assurance that laws could be found, that reason and patience could bring the cosmos within reach of human understanding. What came after Newton was everything that science has become, each discovery a step further up the ladder he built. His body rests, but his thought still moves the stars. When we look back at Isaac Newton now, centuries after his life, the figure we see is larger than any single image could contain. He has been called history's greatest scientist, the man who discovered gravity, the architect of modern physics. His likeness has appeared in statues and paintings, his words copied in textbooks, his name placed alongside the most luminous of history. Yet if we draw closer, the image becomes more complex, more layered, like a portrait painted not in single bold strokes but in thin, translucent glazes. Beneath the public figure, there was always the private man, and together they make a legend that is as human as it is monumental. Newton was, at heart, a paradox. He was at once the reclusive scholar and the authoritative president of the Royal Society. He was the rational mathematician who laid down the laws of motion and the universal law of gravitation, yet also the esoteric thinker who searched for hidden meanings in alchemy and prophecy. He could be both cautious and combative, both humble in his silence and proud in his victories. To imagine Newton simply as the serene father of science is to overlook the storms within him. To imagine him only as an eccentric mystic is to miss the brilliance of his clarity. He was both, and the tension between those selves shaped the extraordinary path of his life. Think of him as a man of many rooms. In one room, dark and shuttered, he bent light through a prism and watched colours scatter on the wall. In another, filled with manuscripts and cryptic symbols, he heated metals and crucibles, dreaming of transmutation. In yet another, He sat in authority at the Royal Society, presiding over debates and deciding which discoveries would be heard. And in yet another, quieter still, he returned to his solitary reflections, writing of biblical prophecy and the secret structure of history. The house of Newton's mind was vast, and few were allowed to enter every chamber. At the foundation of it all was solitude. From his earliest years, abandoned by his mother when she remarried, Newton learned to live apart. Solitude became his shield, but also his soil. When plague drove him from Cambridge to Woolsthorpe, it was solitude that gave him the quiet to imagine calculus, to ponder falling apples, to split light into its hidden colours. Later, when criticism from peers like Robert Hooke or Christian Huygens grew sharp, solitude gave him a retreat where he could regroup, holding his discoveries close until he was ready to release them. Even in his later years, surrounded by admirers and honours, he still carried the air of a man who lived inwardly, who kept part of himself hidden from view. And yet, though solitude nurtured him, rivalry sharpened him. Hooke's criticisms, Leibniz's competing claims to calculus, Flamsteed's star catalogues withheld. These disputes, painful as they were, pressed Newton to define his ideas more firmly, to defend them more forcefully, to assert his authority in ways he might never have done alone. Genius does not always grow in peace. Sometimes it is honed in conflict, shaped like a blade against another blade. Newton's brilliance was his own, but the friction of his age left its marks, carving sharper edges into his legend. Still, what makes Newton enduring is not only what he discovered, but how fully human he remained. He was not a mind detached from body or world. He suffered illness, melancholy, breakdowns of the spirit. He tasted the bitterness of envy and the sweetness of recognition. He longed for secrets that lay beyond the reach of reason, and he sometimes mistook shadows for truths. He never married, and his affections were few, yet he cherished his niece Catherine Barton and left her his household. In these fragments of humanity, the frailty, the obsessions, the small connections, we glimpse a man as real as any of us, one who struggled with limits even as he pressed beyond them. There is a rhythm in his story, a reminder that even the greatest achievements rise from the soil of ordinary life. He was born premature and weak, in a small village in Lincolnshire, destined perhaps for obscurity. He tended sheep, failed as a farmhand, and was considered unremarkable by some early teachers. Yet in that same life, he saw further than anyone before him into the workings of the cosmos. The paradox is striking, that one man could be both so frail and so powerful, so solitary and so universal, so rational and so mystical. It is this paradox that makes him unforgettable. To reflect on Newton is to reflect on the nature of genius itself. Genius is not purity. It is not a straight line from problem to solution, nor a neat collection of triumphs without flaws. Genius is restless, wandering, contradictory. It burns brightly in one place, then drifts into another, sometimes illuminating, sometimes confusing. Newton reminds us that discovery is not only about clarity, but about the courage to follow questions wherever they lead, even into strange and uncharted territory. The legend of Newton is therefore not only in the laws of motion or the spectrum of light, but in the way he lived his questions. He embodies the truth that science is not made by perfect beings but by human beings, with all their doubts and eccentricities, and perhaps that is what makes his story so reassuring. If even Newton wrestled with uncertainty, then the act of wrestling itself is part of the path. If even Newton dreamed beyond reason, then dreaming is not a weakness, but another way the mind explores its world. As you let these reflections settle, imagine Newton not as a statue, but as a man seated at a desk, candlelight, flickering, papers spread before him, a prism lying on the windowsill. He pauses, leans back, and looks into the shadows of the room. his mind moving between the clarity of mathematics and the mystery of prophecy. That is the human in the legend, restless, paradoxical, deeply alone, yet profoundly connected to the universe he sought to understand. And so we arrive at the end of Newton's long story. The years of solitude, the rivalries, the burst of brilliance, the strange diversions into alchemy and prophecy, all have been gathered into one life. It is a story that began with a frail child in a country village and ended with a revered sage buried among kings and poets. Between those points, he helped to redraw the map of the universe. Yet even with all the grandeur, the story is at its heart a human one, a story of curiosity, persistence, and the restless longing to understand. As we pause here, let us not see Newton only as the master of equations or the cold architect of nature's laws. Instead, picture him as a solitary scholar seated at his desk, a prism resting on the windowsill, candlelight flickering across the page. The candle burns steadily, though the wax melts and the shadows lengthen. He leans back, weary, and watches the rainbow shimmer on the wall fade as the night deepens. Outside, the world continues, unaware of the quiet revolutions being born in a shuttered room. Inside, thoughts drift between clarity and mystery, between numbers and dreams. There is comfort in realizing that even for Newton, the mind was never all precision. He too wandered. He too struggled with doubt and fatigue. He too searched for meaning in places where answers did not come easily. To see him this way is to see that the laws of nature were not delivered in thunder or lightning, but shaped in long hours of quiet, with pen scratches on paper and candlelight softening the edges of night. His discoveries grew not from certainty but from patience, from the willingness to sit with questions for as long as it took. The universe he described still surrounds you now. Every motion of your breath, every shift of weight as you sink deeper into rest, follows the laws he set down. Every beam of light that softens the room is made of the same spectrum he once revealed. The tides that move across distant shores, the planets that wheel silently overhead, all move with the rhythm he traced. You're part of the same fabric, carried gently on currents that he once measured, but that were always there, waiting to cradle you as they cradle every star. Think of it this way. As you drift into sleep, your body surrenders to gravity, the same force that drew Newton's thoughts toward falling apples and orbiting moons. Gravity holds you now, not as an idea but as a presence, steady and patient. The air you breathe shifts with the same invisible motions that once stirred his curiosity. The colours that fade as your eyelids close are the same that spilled across his walls when he split light into rainbows. In this way, his story is not far away. It is around you, woven into every quiet detail of your life. And just as Newton's thoughts travelled far beyond his own time, so too can your thoughts wander now, gently, without urgency. You may follow them as they drift, or you may let them slip away like mist across a field at dawn. It does not matter. The laws of nature carry you regardless, steady as tides, quiet as the turning of planets. There is nothing to hold, nothing to grasp. You're already being carried, as Newton himself was, by the same gentle currents of the cosmos. Imagine, for a moment, Westminster Abbey at night. The arches rise high into shadow, the air cool and still, footsteps long gone. Newton rests in silence beneath stone, while above the stars still move according to the principles he revealed. The abbey is hushed, yet the universe hums on, and within that hum is peace. Now bring your thoughts back closer to your own quiet room. Perhaps there is a faint sound in the distance, the ticking of a clock, the soft rush of air, the steady beat of your own heart. Each is a reminder that the world moves in rhythms, and that you are part of those rhythms. Like Newton, you do not need to control them, you need only to rest within them. The candle burns lower, the prism's colours fade from the wall, and the room grows still. The story of Newton is, in the end, a story of reaching. Reaching from solitude into discovery. Reaching from secrecy into publication. Reaching from earthbound questions into cosmic laws. And now, his story reaches you, not as equations on a page, but as a soft reminder that curiosity itself is a kind of lullaby, and that wonder can be a companion to rest. So as you drift now, let the candlelight dim in your imagination. Let the colours of the prism fade into twilight. Let the footsteps of history grow faint in the abbey stone halls. You are safe, carried by the same laws that carried Newton's thoughts. The universe holds you, steady and sure, like a gentle tide. Sleep now, little scholar of the cosmos. The laws of nature will keep watch as you rest, just as they kept watch over Newton's long nights of thought. The stars will continue their silent courses, the earth will turn beneath you, the air will rise and fall in your lungs, and all will remain steady. Rest in the quiet assurance that you too are part of the great unfolding order, held softly in its embrace.